James Hawthorne, a man whose name was synonymous with success and wealth, found himself driving down a winding country road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the past. It had been years since he last visited his hometown, a place he had long tried to forget. The memories he had buried deep now resurfaced with every mile, the familiar landscape pulling him back to a time when he was just a boy, full of dreams and untouched by the harsh realities of life. The town, once bustling with life, now appeared eerily quiet, as if time had stood still. As his car approached the large, weathered house that once belonged to his father, a wave of nostalgia mixed with unease washed over him. The house, an imposing structure that had once been the pride of the neighborhood, now stood in disrepair, its paint peeling and windows cracked. James had always seen the house as a symbol of his father's authority, a place where he could never truly be himself. But now, it was just a shadow of its former self, much like the memories he carried within him. Stepping out of the car, James hesitated before opening the creaky gate that led to the overgrown front yard. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a stark contrast to the fresh, vibrant air he was used to in the city. He couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding as he walked up the path to the front door, the house seeming to loom over him, as if it were alive and watching his every move. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling slightly, and pushed the door open. The inside of the house was just as he remembered, yet different in ways that made his heart ache. The once grand foyer, with its polished wooden floors and elegant staircase, was now covered in dust and cobwebs. Furniture that had once been the centerpiece of family gatherings now lay in disarray, covered with white sheets that had yellowed with age. James walked slowly through the rooms, each one filled with echoes of a past he had tried so hard to escape. The laughter, the arguments, the silence, they all lingered in the air, haunting him. But it wasn't just the memories that haunted James. It was the sense of unfinished business, of things left unsaid and undone. His father, a stern and distant man, had never shown him the love or approval he had craved. Instead, he had been driven to succeed, to prove himself worthy in a world that seemed to offer him nothing but obstacles. Now, standing in the ruins of his childhood home, James wondered if any of it had been worth it. The success, the wealth. What did it all mean if he couldn't find peace within himself? James' mind was racing with thoughts of the past, of the man he had become, when he heard it, a faint, desperate cry that seemed to come from the depths of the house. Help! The voice was weak, filled with a pain that made James' blood run cold. He stood frozen, unsure if he had really heard it, or if it was just another ghost from his past. But then it came again, louder this time, unmistakable in its anguish. Help! James' heart pounded in his chest as he realized the voice was coming from the basement. His first instinct was to run, to leave the house and never look back. But something inside him wouldn't let him go. It was as if the house, or whatever was inside it, had a hold on him, pulling him deeper into its mystery. James found himself walking toward the basement door, his feet moving on their own as if guided by some unseen force. The door was slightly ajar, and as he approached, he could feel the cold, damp air seeping through the crack. He hesitated for a moment, his hand on the doorknob, before pushing it open. The stairs leading down to the basement creaked under his weight, the wood old and brittle from years of neglect. The darkness seemed to close in around him as he descended, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The voice, now clearer and more desperate, echoed off the walls, urging him to hurry. James' breath quickened as he reached the bottom of the stairs, his eyes straining to see in the dim light. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and other remnants of the past, but his attention was drawn to a faint light coming from a corner of the room. James moved toward the light, his heart pounding in his chest. As he got closer, he could see that it was coming from a small, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a weak glow over a door he hadn't noticed before. The door was old, made of heavy wood, and slightly ajar. The voice was coming from behind it, clearer now but still filled with pain. James hesitated, fear gripping him as he reached for the door. What could be on the other side? Was this some kind of trap, or was someone really in need of help? Taking a deep breath, James pushed the door open. The sight that greeted him was beyond anything he could have imagined. The room was small and dark, with stone walls that seemed to close in on him. In the center of the room was a man, chained to the wall, his body frail and emaciated. His clothes were torn and dirty, his hair matted, and his eyes, those eyes, were filled with a desperation that pierced James to his core. "Please, help me," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. James' mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Who was this man? How had he ended up here, in the basement of a house that had been empty for years? And more importantly, why had no one ever found him? Questions flooded his mind, but there were no answers, only the desperate plea of the man in front of him. James knew he couldn't leave him there, but he also knew that whatever had happened here was far from ordinary. This was no accident, no coincidence. This was something darker, something that had been hidden away for a long time. James' breath was shallow as he stared at the chained man before him, his mind reeling with disbelief. The darkness of the basement seemed to press in on him, the weak light casting eerie shadows that danced across the cold, stone walls. The man's eyes, wide with fear and desperation, locked onto James, silently pleading for help. James felt his heart hammering in his chest, a primal instinct urging him to run, to flee from whatever horror he had stumbled upon. But something stronger held him in place, a need to understand, to unravel the mystery that had suddenly consumed his life. As if moving through a dream, James took a tentative step forward, his shoes scraping against the gritty floor. The man flinched at the sound, his body tensing as if expecting a blow. James hesitated, sensing the deep fear that gripped the man. Who are you?" James finally managed to ask, his voice trembling with uncertainty. The man's response was a whisper, barely audible, but it was enough to send a chill down James' spine. "Please, I need to get out of here," the man pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. James' mind raced with questions, but the man's condition demanded immediate action. Without thinking further, James reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the room. He dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. Frustration surged through him as he realized he was completely cut off from the outside world. He had to act now, on his own. He moved closer, trying to figure out how to release the man from his chains. The metal was old and rusted, but still strong enough to hold the man captive. "Hang on, I'll get you out," James said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rising panic. He searched the room for something, anything, that could help. His eyes fell on a rusted old toolbox in the corner, half hidden beneath a pile of rags. He rushed over and pried it open, his hands trembling as he rummaged through the contents. Finally, he found a pair of bolt cutters, their edges dulled by years of neglect. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He returned to the man, who watched him with a mixture of hope and fear. The first cut was the hardest, the metal resisting before finally giving way with a loud snap. The man winced but remained silent, his eyes fixed on James as if he were his last hope. James worked quickly, the sound of the chains falling to the floor echoing in the small room. When the last shackle was removed, the man collapsed into James' arms, too weak to stand on his own. James felt the weight of the man's frail body and the gravity of the situation. Whoever this man was, he had been through hell, and it was far from over. With great effort, James managed to lift the man to his feet, supporting him as they made their way back up the stairs. Each step was a struggle, the man's breath coming in ragged gasps. The air grew warmer as they ascended, but the darkness still clung to them like a shroud. James' mind raced with thoughts of what might await them outside the basement, whether the nightmare would end there or if it was just the beginning. But he pushed those fears aside, focusing on the task at hand. Getting this man to safety, they emerged into the main part of the house, the dim light of the setting sun filtering through the dirty windows. James guided the man to an old armchair in the living room, where he collapsed, utterly exhausted. For a moment, they both sat in silence, the only sound the man's labored breathing. James looked around the room, the familiar surroundings now tainted by the knowledge of what he had found below. He couldn't shake the feeling that this house held more secrets, more darkness waiting to be uncovered. Finally, James broke the silence. "Who did this to you? How did you end up down there?" The man looked at him with eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. I don't know how long I've been down there," he began, his voice hoarse, "but I remember your father." The mention of his father sent a jolt through James, his mind reeling with disbelief. How could this man know his father? What connection did they share? And what did it mean for James? The man's voice grew weaker as he spoke, his words laced with pain. "Your father, he was a good man once, but something changed him, something dark. He did this to me. I was his mistake." The words hit James like a physical blow, the weight of them sinking deep into his soul. He struggled to reconcile the image of the father he had known with the horror of what he was hearing. The man's condition, his captivity. Was it possible that his father, the man who had raised him, could have done something so monstrous? James felt a surge of anger, confusion, and sorrow all at once. The man's story was unraveling everything he thought he knew about his past, about his family. But there was no denying the truth of what he saw before him. The broken man who had been left to rot in the darkness. James knew that he had to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He owed it to this man, and he owed it to himself. But where would he even begin? The answers seemed as distant as the past he had tried so hard to forget. The man's breathing grew more shallow, and James knew he needed medical attention. But before he could figure out what to do next, the man grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Don't let them find me. Please. They'll take me back. They'll take me back to the darkness." His eyes were wide with fear, and James felt a chill run down his spine. Who were they? What kind of nightmare had this man escaped from, and what danger did it now pose to both of them? James nodded, though he had no idea how he could protect this man or what he was truly up against. But there was no turning back now. The mystery had ensnared him, and there was only one way out, through the darkness, into whatever truth awaited him on the other side. James felt a strange sense of déjà vu as he looked into the man's eyes, trying to piece together the fragments of a puzzle that seemed too impossible to solve. The man's face, though gaunt and worn by suffering, stirred something deep within James, a recognition that he couldn't quite place. The silence between them grew heavy, thick with unspoken truths and buried memories. James swallowed hard, his throat dry, as he finally asked the question that had been gnawing at him since the moment he found the man. "What's your name?" The man's response was a whisper, fragile yet powerful enough to shatter James' world. "Edward. My name is Edward." James' breath caught in his throat, his heart skipping a beat as the name reverberated through his mind. Edward. The name carried with it a weight that James couldn't comprehend. A name that was both familiar and foreign, like a word in a language he had once known but long since forgotten. "Edward," James repeated, the sound of it strange on his tongue. How do you know my father?" Edward's eyes, once clouded with fear, now shone with a mix of sorrow and hope. "James, I'm your brother." The words hung in the air, each one landing with the force of a blow. James staggered back, his mind reeling, struggling to process the revelation. A brother? He had never known he had a brother. His father had never mentioned it. There had been no hint, no whisper of another child. The idea seemed absurd, impossible. And yet, as he looked at Edward, he couldn't deny the resemblance. The same sharp jawline, the same piercing eyes. But how could this be? James' mind raced with questions, each one more troubling than the last. If Edward was truly his brother, then what kind of life had he led? Hidden away in the shadows, in chains? What kind of father had kept such a secret, locked away not just from the world, but from his own son? The image of his father, the stern and distant man who had shaped so much of James' life, began to crumble, revealing a darkness that James had never imagined. He felt a surge of anger and betrayal, emotions that twisted his insides and left him feeling hollow. Edward, sensing the turmoil in James, reached out a trembling hand. "I know it's hard to believe," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But it's true. I've been here. I don't know how long. I lost track of time a long time ago. But I've always known about you, James. Father, he told me about you, about the life you had, out there in the world. He kept me here because he said I was dangerous." The word dangerous sent a shiver down James' spine. What could his father have meant by that? What kind of danger could Edward have posed? James stared at Edward, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. He tried to find some semblance of the truth in Edward's words, but everything he thought he knew about his family was unraveling before his eyes. Why didn't he tell me?" James asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why did he keep you locked away?" Edward's gaze dropped to the floor, his face contorted with pain. "He thought I was sick, mentally ill, but I wasn't, not at first. He made me this way, James. The isolation, the darkness, it changes you." The room seemed to close in around them, the walls of the old house bearing witness to the secrets that had festered within them for years. James felt an overwhelming sense of loss, not just for the brother he had never known, but for the father he had believed in, a father who had, in truth, been a stranger all along. The realization cut deep, a wound that bled anger and sorrow. But beneath it all, there was something else, a glimmer of hope, fragile and tentative. Edward was alive. Against all odds, he had survived. And now, perhaps, they could find a way to heal together. Edward's voice broke through James' thoughts, bringing him back to the present. "I've dreamed of this moment for so long," he said, his eyes wet with tears. "I always hoped you'd come back, that you'd find me. I used to imagine what it would be like to see you, to talk to you. But now that you're here, I don't know what to say." James felt a lump in his throat, the weight of Edward's words pressing down on him. What could he say? How could he possibly make sense of this nightmare? But one thing was clear. He couldn't turn his back on Edward now. James knelt beside Edward, taking his brother's hand in his own. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "I don't know how, but we will. You're not alone anymore, Edward. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The words felt like a promise, a vow to make up for all the years that had been stolen from them. James didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't walk away from his brother. Whatever it took, he would help Edward rebuild his life, piece by fragile piece. As they sat there, the room seemed to grow quieter, the air thick with the weight of all that had been said, and all that had yet to be spoken. James knew that this was just the beginning, that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. The life he had built for himself, the success and wealth that had once seemed so important, now felt hollow in comparison to the bond he was beginning to forge with Edward. This was his chance to make things right. But even as James tried to focus on the future, the past loomed large, casting a shadow over everything. The secrets that had been kept from him, the lies that had shaped his life. He couldn't escape them, no matter how much he wanted to. And there was still so much he didn't understand. What had driven his father to such cruelty? What had he been trying to protect or hide? James knew that he couldn't move forward until he had answers, until he had uncovered the full truth. And that meant confronting the past, no matter how painful it might be. Edward's hand tightened around James, as if sensing the turmoil in his brother's mind. "We'll get through this together," Edward said, his voice stronger now, filled with a determination that surprised James. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." James nodded, grateful for the solidarity that was beginning to form between them. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was facing it alone. Together, they would confront the demons of their past and build a future that was truly their own. As the initial shock of Edward's revelation began to wear off, James found himself grappling with a profound sense of loss. The house, once a symbol of his father's authority, now felt like a mausoleum of forgotten truths and buried pain. The very walls seemed to echo with the cries of a past that had been hidden from him, a past that was now unraveling with every word Edward spoke. James sat beside his brother, his mind spinning with questions, but beneath it all was a deep, aching sadness, an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. Edward's presence in the house, once unthinkable, now felt like the key to understanding the mysteries that had haunted James for years. But with each answer came new wounds, fresh and raw. "How could he do this to you?" James asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a betrayal too vast to comprehend. Edward looked down, his hands trembling as he struggled to find the words. "He wasn't always like this," Edward began, his voice thick with emotion. "There was a time when he was kind, but something changed him." The pain in Edward's voice was palpable, and James could feel it reverberating in his own heart. He had spent his entire life trying to earn his father's approval, to be the son his father could be proud of. But now, as he listened to Edward's story, he realized that the man he had idolized was not the man he thought he knew. "He told me I was cursed," Edward continued, his voice breaking. "He said that I was a danger to everyone around me, that I had to be kept away to protect the family. But I never understood why. I wasn't sick, at least not at first." James felt a surge of anger rising within him, a fury that burned through the layers of confusion and sadness. How could his father have done this? How could he have locked away his own son, condemned him to a life of darkness and isolation? "He had no right," James said, his voice trembling with rage. "He had no right to do that to you." Edward looked up, his eyes filled with a sorrow that cut James to the core. "I know," Edward replied, his voice barely audible, but he believed it was the only way. And after a while, I started to believe it too. The confession hit James like a blow, the weight of it sinking deep into his soul. The thought of Edward, alone in the dark, believing himself to be cursed, was almost too much to bear. "You're not cursed," James said firmly, reaching out to take Edward's hand. "You're my brother. And whatever he did, whatever he made you believe, it's not true. You're not cursed, Edward." The words felt hollow, inadequate in the face of such deep-seated pain, but James knew he had to say them. He had to try to undo the damage that had been done, even if it seemed impossible. Edward squeezed James' hand, his grip weak but desperate. "I don't know who I am anymore," Edward admitted, his voice trembling. "I've spent so long in the dark. I don't know how to live in the light." The admission broke something inside James, a realization that this was not just about uncovering the truth. It was about healing, about finding a way to move forward. "We'll figure it out," James promised, his voice filled with determination. "We'll take it one step at a time. You're not alone, Edward. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing down with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. James knew that there was more to Edward's story, more that had been hidden away in the darkness of the past. But he also knew that pushing too hard, too fast, could do more harm than good. Edward was fragile, his spirit battered by years of isolation and fear. James had to tread carefully to be the brother that Edward needed. Someone who would listen, who would understand, who would help him find his way back to the world. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of purpose, a reason to fight. The life he had built for himself, the wealth, the success, suddenly felt meaningless in the face of Edward's suffering. What good was it all if he couldn't use it to help his brother, to make things right? James made a silent vow to himself, a promise that he would do whatever it took to give Edward the life he deserved. But even as he made that vow, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were more secrets buried within these walls, secrets that would test the strength of their newfound bond. Edward's voice broke the silence, bringing James back to the present. "There's something else you need to know," Edward said, his voice trembling. "Something about Father, about what he was hiding." James' heart skipped a beat, a cold dread settling in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't sure he could handle another revelation, another piece of the puzzle that threatened to shatter the fragile understanding he had begun to build. But he knew that whatever Edward had to say, he needed to hear it. "What is it?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward hesitated, his eyes filled with a fear that made James' blood run cold. "There were others," Edward finally said, his voice barely audible. "Others like me, hidden away, locked up. I don't know where they are now, but I remember hearing their voices. They were scared, just like me. And then one day they were gone." The revelation hit James like a tidal wave, the enormity of it crashing down on him with a force that left him breathless. Others? How many others had suffered the same fate as Edward? How many lives had been destroyed by the man he had called father? James felt the ground shift beneath him, the foundation of everything he had believed in crumbling away. This was no longer just about Edward. This was about uncovering a truth that had been buried deep, a truth that had the power to destroy everything James had ever known. But as terrifying as that prospect was, James knew he couldn't turn back now. He had to keep going, to dig deeper, to find the answers that had been hidden for so long. For Edward, for the others, he had to uncover the full truth, no matter the cost. Edward looked at James, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "You're the only one who can do this," Edward said, his voice trembling. "You're the only one who can make things right." James nodded, the weight of Edward's words settling on his shoulders. He didn't know if he was ready for what lay ahead, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now, not when so much was at stake. "I'll do whatever it takes," James promised, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We'll get through this, Edward. We'll find the truth, and we'll make things right." James sat in the old armchair, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The revelations of the past few hours had left him reeling, his once stable world now teetering on the edge of chaos. Edward, his brother, a brother he had never known, was sitting just a few feet away, his frail body wrapped in a blanket, shivering from more than just the cold. James' heart ached for him, but it also burned with anger, confusion, and fear. What was he supposed to do now? The weight of the decision before him was almost unbearable. The house, with its dark corners and hidden secrets, seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with the memories it held. The thought of selling it, of leaving it behind as he had originally planned, now felt impossible. How could he walk away from the place that had held his brother captive for so many years? But the alternative, staying, facing the truth, and potentially exposing his father's monstrous actions, was equally daunting. James knew that whatever choice he made, there would be no going back. The decision he faced would change everything, for better or worse. Edward's voice, weak but determined, broke through the silence. "You don't have to do this, James," he said, his eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored James' own. "You don't owe me anything. I've lived with this, with what he did for so long. I don't want you to destroy your life because of me." But James could hear the fear behind Edward's words, the unspoken plea for help. Edward might have resigned himself to his fate, but James couldn't accept that. He couldn't walk away, not now, not after everything he had learned. James turned to look at Edward, the firelight casting shadows on his face. "I can't just leave you here," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't pretend that none of this happened. You're my brother. Edward. I won't abandon you." The words felt like a vow, a promise that he was determined to keep. But even as he spoke them, he knew the enormity of the task before him. If he chose to stay, to fight for the truth, he would be risking everything: his reputation, his career, his entire life. The community revered his father. They saw him as a pillar of strength and morality. How would they react if they learned the truth? The thought of exposing his father's deeds to the world filled James with dread. The man he had known as a distant, yet respected figure in his life was now revealed to be someone far darker, far more complex. How could he reconcile the man he had admired with the monster Edward described? And what would happen to Edward if the truth came out? The community might turn against them both, seeing them as the children of a madman, tainted by his sins. But more than that, James feared the toll it would take on Edward, who had already suffered so much. As these thoughts churned in his mind, James felt a growing sense of responsibility. A responsibility not just to Edward, but to the truth. He couldn't live with himself if he walked away now, if he left the truth buried in the darkness of this house. But he also knew that the path ahead was fraught with danger, both for him and for Edward. The decision weighed heavily on him, pulling him in two directions at once. Protecting Edward meant shielding him from the world, from the harsh light of scrutiny that would undoubtedly follow. But it also meant denying him the justice he deserved. James stood up, pacing the room as he tried to make sense of his thoughts. He had always prided himself on his ability to make tough decisions, to navigate the complex world of business with a clear head and a steady hand. But this was different. This wasn't about money or power. This was about family, about doing what was right, even when it was the hardest thing in the world. He could feel the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him, the expectations of the community, the fear of losing everything he had worked so hard to build. But more than anything, he felt the weight of Edward's gaze, watching him, waiting for him to make the choice. Finally, James stopped, turning to face his brother. "I'm going to do what's right," he said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "No matter what it costs me, I'm going to make sure you get the help you need. And I'm going to make sure that what happened to you, what happened to the others, doesn't stay buried." Edward's eyes widened in surprise, a flicker of hope breaking through the despair that had clouded them for so long. "Are you sure, James?" he asked, his voice trembling. "This could ruin everything for you." James nodded, the decision finally clear in his mind. "Some things are more important than reputation or success," he said, his voice steady. "You're my brother, Edward. I can't change what happened to you, but I can make sure that it doesn't continue. I can make sure that you're taken care of, that you get the life you deserve." The resolve in James' voice was unshakable, a reflection of the man he had become. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the cost would be high, but he was ready to face it, because it was the right thing to do. Edward looked at James, tears welling up in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for this, but thank you." James shook his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "You don't owe me anything, Edward," he said softly. "We're family. We're supposed to take care of each other." The words felt both comforting and painful, a reminder of the bond that had been denied to them for so long. But now, at least, they had a chance to rebuild it, to create something new out of the wreckage of their past. As the fire crackled in the hearth, James felt a sense of calm settle over him, a calm that came from knowing he was making the right choice, no matter how difficult it was. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. He would protect Edward, he would fight for the truth, and he would face whatever consequences came his way. For the first time in his life, James felt truly free. Free to be the man he wanted to be, free to make his own choices, and free to stand by those choices, no matter what. The decision had been made, but James knew that the hardest part was still ahead of him. The truth, once revealed, would not only upend his life, but also shake the very foundations of the community that had revered his father for so long. He couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as he prepared for what was to come. The town's elders, the people who had known his father, who had looked up to him as a paragon of virtue. How would they react when they learned the dark secrets that had been hidden for so long? James steeled himself, knowing that there was no turning back. The day of the confrontation arrived sooner than James had anticipated. He had arranged for a meeting with the town's most influential figures, those who had been closest to his father, who had worked with him, and who had admired him. The gathering was to take place in the old town hall, a place steeped in history and tradition. As James walked through the doors, he could feel the weight of that history bearing down on him. The room was filled with portraits of past leaders, including his father, their eyes seemingly following him as he made his way to the front. The faces of the town's elders were a mixture of curiosity and concern as James stood before them. They had no idea what he was about to reveal, but the tension in the room was palpable. James took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment that would change everything. He began to speak, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. He told them about Edward, about the years of torment and isolation his brother had endured, and about the others, those who had been hidden away, lost to the darkness. The silence that followed his words was deafening. As the reality of what James was saying began to sink in, the expressions on the elders' faces shifted from disbelief to horror. Whispers spread through the room, growing louder as the shock turned to anger and betrayal. The image of James' father, the man they had trusted and admired, was shattered in an instant. The elders demanded answers, their voices rising in a cacophony of outrage and confusion. James stood firm, knowing that this was the only way to begin the healing process, to bring the truth into the light, no matter how painful it was. One of the elders, a man who had been particularly close to James' father, stood up, his face flushed with anger. "How dare you tarnish your father's memory like this?" he shouted, his voice shaking with emotion. He was a great man, a man who did more for this town than anyone else. And now you come here with these lies, these baseless accusations? James felt the sting of the words, but he didn't waver. "These are not lies," he replied, his voice calm but resolute. "I wish they were. But the truth is, my father was not the man we all thought he was. And it's time we faced that truth." The room erupted into chaos, the elders shouting over one another, some demanding proof, others refusing to believe what they were hearing. James felt a wave of despair wash over him. Had he made a mistake? Had he misjudged the strength of their convictions? But then, amidst the uproar, a voice cut through the noise. "Let him speak." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at the speaker, an elderly woman who had been a close friend of James' mother. Her voice was calm, but there was a steeliness in her gaze that commanded attention. "Let him finish." James nodded in gratitude before continuing. He recounted the details of his father's actions, the evidence he had uncovered, and the stories of the victims. People who had been forgotten, erased from history by a man they had all trusted. The elders listened in stunned silence, the reality of the situation sinking in with every word. By the time James finished, the room was filled with a heavy, oppressive silence. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, now hung in the air like a dark cloud, impossible to ignore. As the silence stretched on, the elderly woman who had spoken earlier stood up again. "We cannot change the past," she said, her voice filled with sorrow, "but we can choose how we move forward. This town has been built on lies, on secrets that have festered for too long. It's time to face the truth, no matter how painful it is." Her words seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the room. The elders began to murmur among themselves, their anger giving way to a somber acceptance. They knew that there was no going back, no way to undo the damage that had been done. James felt a sense of relief, but also a deep sadness. The confrontation had been necessary, but it had come at a great cost. The town, once united in its reverence for his father, was now divided, its people struggling to reconcile the man they had known with the truth that had been revealed. But James knew that this was the only way to begin the healing process, to confront the past head-on, no matter how painful it was. He could only hope that, in time, the town would come to understand the importance of what he had done. As the meeting came to an end, James found himself alone in the town hall, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. He had done what he had set out to do. He had brought the truth to light, no matter the cost. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of the pain he had caused, not just to the town, but to himself and to Edward. James knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the consequences of his actions would continue to ripple through the town for years to come. But he also knew that he had done the right thing. In the days that followed, the town was abuzz with talk of the revelations that had come to light. Some people supported James, praising his courage in standing up for the truth, while others condemned him, accusing him of betraying his father's legacy. The divide was deep, and it would take time for the town to heal. But James remained steadfast in his resolve. He knew that he had done what was necessary, that he had faced the past and brought it into the light, and for that, he could find some measure of peace. The days following the confrontation in the town hall were a blur of emotions and upheaval for James. The once solid ground beneath his feet had shifted, leaving him to navigate a landscape of shattered trust and painful truths. The town was still reeling from the revelations, the shockwaves of his father's hidden life reverberating through the community. But amidst the turmoil, James found a new sense of clarity, a determination to move forward, not just for himself, but for Edward, and for all those whose lives had been touched by the darkness of the past. James knew that he couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but he was determined to make amends in whatever way he could. The first step was ensuring that Edward received the care he needed. The years of isolation had taken a toll on his brother's physical and mental health, and James was committed to providing him with the best possible treatment. He enlisted the help of a team of specialists, experts in trauma and rehabilitation, to work with Edward. It was a slow and painful process, but James could see the small signs of progress, glimpses of the brother he might have known if things had been different. As Edward began to heal, so too did the relationship between the two brothers. They spent long hours talking, sharing memories, and piecing together the fragments of their lives. For James, these conversations were a revelation, an opportunity to learn about the brother he had never known, and to understand the depth of the pain and loneliness Edward had endured. For Edward, it was a chance to reconnect with the world, to find a sense of belonging that had been denied to him for so long. The bond that had been forged in the darkness of their shared past was now growing stronger, a light that guided them both toward a brighter future. The old house, once a place of torment and secrecy, was transformed into a sanctuary of healing and renewal. James oversaw the renovations himself, determined to strip away the layers of decay and neglect that had taken hold over the years. The house was restored to its former glory, but with a new purpose, a place where Edward could feel safe, where they could both start anew. The heavy drapes that had once kept the light out were replaced with large windows that let the sunshine flood in, filling the rooms with warmth and hope. The echoes of the past were still there, but they were no longer haunting. They were a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. As the house was restored, so too was James' sense of purpose. The business empire he had built, which had once been the center of his life, now seemed secondary to the work he was doing with Edward. James began to shift his focus, using his resources to support causes that aligned with the lessons he had learned, organizations dedicated to mental health, trauma recovery, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. He knew that he couldn't change the past, but he could help shape a better future for others who had suffered as Edward had. The town, too, began to heal, though the process was slow and fraught with challenges. The revelations had divided the community, leaving deep scars that would take time to mend. But as the weeks and months passed, a sense of acceptance began to take hold. People started to see James not as the son who had betrayed his father, but as a man who had had the courage to face the truth and to fight for justice. The town's leaders, who had once been so resistant to change, began to work with James to create new programs that addressed the issues that had been brought to light. Slowly, the town began to rebuild, its foundation stronger for having faced its darkest secrets. Edward's progress was slow, but steady. With each passing day, he grew stronger, both physically and emotionally. The nightmares that had plagued him for years began to fade, replaced by dreams of a future filled with possibilities. James was there every step of the way, providing the support and encouragement that Edward needed to keep moving forward. The bond between the two brothers, once strained by years of separation and pain, was now unbreakable. They had been through the worst together and had come out the other side stronger for it. As the seasons changed, James and Edward found themselves settling into a new rhythm of life. The house, once a place of fear and darkness, was now filled with laughter and light. They spent their days working together on the property, tending to the garden, restoring the old barn, and making plans for the future. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of peace, a feeling that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer held him down. It was a part of him, a part of his story, but it did not define him. The transformation of the house became a symbol of the broader changes taking place in their lives. What had once been a place of confinement and despair was now a testament to the power of resilience and renewal. The community, too, began to see the house in a new light, not as a monument to a tarnished legacy, but as a beacon of hope and redemption. Visitors came to see the renovations, to hear the story of the two brothers who had overcome so much, and to take inspiration from their journey. The house and the land around it became a place of healing for many, a reminder that even the darkest places could be filled with light. James often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, to this moment. He had started out with the intention of closing a chapter in his life, of selling the house and leaving the past behind. But instead, he had found himself opening up to a new beginning, one that was richer and more meaningful than he could have ever imagined. The success he had once chased so relentlessly now seemed hollow in comparison to the fulfillment he felt in his new life. He had found something far more valuable than wealth or power. He had found his family, his purpose, and a sense of peace that he had never known before. In the end, James realized that the journey he had taken had been about more than just uncovering the truth. It had been about redefining his future, about letting go of the expectations and the burdens of the past, and about embracing the possibilities that lay ahead. He had faced the darkness, and in doing so, he had found the light. The road had been long and difficult, but it had led him to a place of healing, of hope, and of love. And that, he knew, was the greatest gift of all. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, James found himself spending more and more time in quiet reflection. The house, now filled with light and laughter, had become a place of healing not just for Edward, but for James as well. But even as they moved forward, James knew there was one final piece of the journey that he needed to confront, one last shadow that lingered in the corners of his mind. It was the question of forgiveness, the burden of anger and betrayal that he had carried with him ever since he learned the truth about his father. Forgiveness was not something that came easily to James. The betrayal he felt ran deep, cutting to the very core of his identity. How could he forgive a man who had caused so much pain, not just to him, but to Edward, and to others whose lives had been destroyed by his father's actions? The anger he felt was a fire that had burned within him, fueling his determination to uncover the truth and bring it to light. But now, with the truth revealed and the path to healing begun, James found himself questioning whether that fire was something he needed to let go of. Edward, too, was grappling with the weight of forgiveness. For years, he had lived in the shadow of their father's cruelty, believing himself to be cursed, dangerous, unworthy of love. But as he healed, as he began to reclaim his life, Edward struggled with the question of whether he could forgive the man who had taken so much from him. The bond between the brothers had grown strong, but there were moments when the pain of the past threatened to pull them back into the darkness. Forgiveness, it seemed, was the final hurdle they both needed to overcome. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a warm, golden glow, James and Edward found themselves sitting together on the porch, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. It was Edward who finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but steady. "Do you think it's possible to forgive him?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. The question hung in the air, and for a long moment, James didn't know how to answer. The truth was, he wasn't sure, but he knew that they couldn't move forward until they had at least tried. "I don't know," James admitted, his voice filled with the weight of uncertainty. "I've been asking myself the same thing. I want to, but it's hard. What he did, it's unforgivable. But holding on to the anger, the pain, I don't want it to define us, Edward. We've been through so much. We deserve to be free of it, to live our lives without that shadow hanging over us." Edward nodded, his expression thoughtful. "But how do we do that? How do we forgive someone who isn't here to ask for it, who never showed us any kindness or remorse?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair as he searched for the right words. "I think forgiveness is more for us than it is for him," he said slowly. "It's about letting go of the hold he has on us, of the power he still holds over our lives. Forgiving him doesn't mean we forget what he did, or that we excuse it, but maybe it's a way to take back control, to say that we won't let his actions dictate our future." Edward considered this, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe forgiveness is the only way we can truly be free." The conversation weighed heavily on James, and that night, as he lay in bed, he found himself thinking about his father, not as the monster he had come to know, but as the man he had once admired, the man who had shaped so much of his life. The memories were a tangle of contradictions, moments of tenderness mixed with moments of cold, distant authority. James realized that part of his struggle with forgiveness was rooted in the love he had once felt for his father, a love that had been shattered by the revelations of the past. Forgiving his father would mean reconciling those two images, finding a way to accept the man as a whole, flawed and broken. In the days that followed, James and Edward continued their conversations about forgiveness, each wrestling with their own emotions and memories. It was not a decision that came easily, and there were moments when the anger and resentment threatened to overwhelm them. But slowly, they began to find a sense of peace, a way to move forward without the weight of the past dragging them down. They realized that forgiveness was not a single act, but a process, a journey that they would need to take together, one step at a time. The breakthrough came one afternoon, as they were working together in the garden, tending to the flowers that had begun to bloom around the house. Edward paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, and looked at James with a small, tentative smile. "I think I'm ready," he said softly. "I'm ready to forgive him, not for his sake, but for ours." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, the tension that had been building between them finally beginning to ease. "Me too," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't want to carry this burden anymore. It's time to let it go." They stood together in the garden, the sun shining down on them, and in that moment, James felt a sense of closure, of resolution. The journey had been long and painful, but they had made it through, together. Forgiveness did not erase the past, but it allowed them to move forward, to build a future that was not defined by the darkness of their father's actions. It was a release, a way to reclaim their lives and their identities, to say that they were not prisoners of the past, but authors of their own stories. In the months that followed, James and Edward continued to heal, both individually and as brothers. The house, once a symbol of their father's power, had become a place of renewal, of growth. The community, too, had begun to heal, the rift that had been caused by the revelations slowly starting to mend. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt and pain, but they faced them together with a newfound strength and resilience. The weight of the past had not disappeared, but it had become lighter, more manageable, as they learned to carry it together. In the end, James realized that forgiveness was not about absolution, but about liberation. It was about freeing themselves from the hold their father had on them, about reclaiming their lives and their futures. It was a choice, a decision to move forward with love and hope, rather than with anger and resentment. And in that choice, they found a sense of peace that had eluded them for so long. The future was still uncertain, still full of challenges, but for the first time, they faced it with open hearts, ready to embrace whatever came next. As you've just seen, the journey of forgiveness, healing, and reclaiming one's life is never easy, but it's a path worth taking. If this story moved you, I invite you to join us on this journey by subscribing to our channel. Don't miss out on the next story. Just click on the video that's on your screen now. And if this story touched your heart, please like the video and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Lastly, if you'd like to support our work, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link pinned in the comments where you can contribute. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life every day. Thank you for being part of our community.